everyone has a rough idea of what pedagogy is, but it's very hard to define. And I think our speakers, when I introduce them, will assist us to think through what we mean by pedagogy. But from our side as the festival organizers, what we have in mind are in particular things like teaching methods, methods of assessment, sort of all the formal and informal ways in which people learn. So if the first session was talking about inequality, just broadly speaking, what is it, how does it manifest in economics? This session is to really drill down and think about how the curriculum is constructed, think about how things are tested and what are all the various ways in which students engage with the economics curriculum. So to kick us off, we'll have a very short Google Docking exercise on what makes a positive learning experience. And the idea here is just to spend, a very short time, namely we've allocated about 2 minutes only for us to take a moment and reflect on so everyone should reflect on a recent positive learning experience. So one where you've learned something and just say 3 or 4 things about it in a bullet point, maybe 1 sentence on what the experience was and 2 or 3 sentences on what made it a positive learning experience. 2 minutes is very short, so please just try to get your thoughts out and then we'll move on with the session. So has the prompt been posted in? Okay, so the prompt is way down on page 9. Being connected to people. There's one on a book and having to grapple with a certain form of social theory. So there's some nice tasks, but I think we're going to go out into our breakout rooms and reflect more on these experiences. So for this next session, please have a look. Please have a look at the list that we've come up with. And in our breakout rooms, the next prompt is to sort of have a look at those and then discuss the ways in which, so reflect on these experiences, excuse me, and then talk further about how to switch from passive learning to active learning. And that's going to be relevant for our discussion on pedagogy. So are we ready to put people in breakout rooms? Gone through that brief reflection, as I said, because we're kind of leading into the discussion we're going to have now from each of our 3 speakers, in particular on pedagogy in economics. So We've had a few reflections, just looking at some of the reflections in the breakout rooms. Only 2 groups have mentioned, wrote down the breakout room. So maybe I'll ask the other people in the other breakout rooms just to say in 30 seconds what they've picked up on. I think in the group I was in, we spoke a lot about the importance of personal experience and knowing what the purpose of learning is, especially in the school context. Learning experiences are positive when they're shared with others. And I think another important role was seeing the learning and how it connects to other forms of learning. So knowing what other subjects are saying about it. Could people in the other breakout rooms perhaps give us in 30 seconds what they've discussed, and then we'll go on to the speaker presentations. So if you could just pick up your hands, whoever was in the Tandika Mkandawira breakout room. Can someone from the other rooms please just share short reflections? That's Matthew. Matthew, please go ahead.
Hi, yes. Can you hear me?
Yes, you can.
Yes. Basically, 4 points came up. So some of the things that we found weren't really effective.
And I think it's okay if we go in that order. So just to give an introduction to Professor Amit Basol. He's an associate professor of economics at the School of Arts and Sciences at Azim Premji University, Bangalore, where he also heads the Center for Sustainable Employment. He has a PhD from the University of Massachusetts, Amherst. His principal fields of research are poverty and inequality, informality, employment, structural change, and political economy of knowledge. He's also taught undergraduate and MA courses at UMass Boston, UMass Amherst, and at Bucknell University. These include Introduction to Economics, Economic Development, Political Economy of Development, and Gender and Development. So Professor Amit, if you could please take it away for us.
Thank you. Thanks a lot. And thank you to the whole REFA team for inviting me. I'm really looking forward to, I've already actually had some interesting discussions in this half an hour, and I'm looking forward to hearing more interesting perspectives. And the overall program looks great. So let me just jump right into it. I'll start by way of a little bit about myself and my journey of economics, because I think it sort of puts in perspective how I approach my teaching. So I did not start off in economics, and I never had an undergraduate education in economics, which is both, as you can imagine, a blessing and a curse. Economics is not in my bones the way it would be if you learned it all the way through, but that also means I haven't had to unlearn a lot of things that you learn in economics, and then you have to sort of get used to thinking in a different way. And I can expand on that later if that comment is cryptic. So I did not do economics early on. I only came to it very late in life during my PhD. And I did my PhD in a program in UMass Amherst, which is a very pluralist, sort of heterodox program, where I was exposed to very different kinds of schools of thought in economics, including, of course, what one usually calls the mainstream school, the neoclassical type thinking, or Walrasian, more technically Walrasian type of microeconomics. And then, but also we were exposed to Marxian, feminist, institutionalist, and other perspectives. So my training has been from the beginning like that, and I really grew to appreciate during my graduate time the how much you can learn by putting different schools of thought in dialogue with each other. If you sort of go through the exercise of thinking, how is a particular problem conceptualized in a particular tradition, and why is it thought of that way? And that stood me in good stead when I started teaching. I've been teaching now for about roughly 10 years, little less than 10 years, in different places, and I've taught most of my courses. I've had political economy as a sort of as an anchor, whether I'm teaching standard economics or gender and development or development economics and so forth. What I mean by that is power and relationships between groups, be it power as class, manifested as class, or patriarchy, or in the Indian case, caste. We've been doing some of that recently, or race when I was teaching in the US. That was never, as far as possible, I could manage an afterthought. It was always there in my thinking. So I've tried to do that. So that's just by way of a little bit of personal thing. Now, what I want to really talk about in terms of pedagogy and what has worked for me is that for topics like inequality or power, which is closely related, where the ideas have been contested from the beginning of the history of modern economics, and possibly even longer, it's really useful to make students aware of the long history of different ways of thinking about this in economics itself. And I'm emphasizing that because I'm addressing my remarks to economics pedagogy, right? So there are other disciplines where you start off in a much more welcoming way, let's say, when you talk about inequality or power. That is not the case in economics because of the hegemony of a very particular way of doing economics. And that particular way has evolved for reasons, for historical reasons, that also it's useful to make students aware of. Why, for example, would the Pareto principle be a widely accepted principle for judging social outcomes? Right? The Pareto principle is a very particular kind of thing. It privileges the status quo in a way that others may not. So redistribution, the onus falls on the person who's arguing for redistribution to make a good case for it, right? And there's a reason why that exists that way. Or why can't you make interpersonal utility comparisons? Because once you start allowing interpersonal utility comparisons and you put it together with your standard kind of concave utility functions that everybody learns about, then you can make very good cases for an equal distribution of income, because that is what is going to maximize the social welfare function. But if you don't allow those comparisons, then you don't have a ground anymore or you've lost that particular piece of ground for arguing for equality. So the discipline has very particularly sort of assumed away or brushed away over its history conceptual tools that exist within the discipline to address a lot of these issues. I'll give you another example. If you think about the difference between relative inequality and absolute inequality, most of the time in economics, when you're taught inequality, it's relative inequality. You're looking at some kind of ratio of incomes, or you're looking at the Gini coefficient. These are all mean independent measures. And the reason typically given is that we want to make comparisons, let's say across societies, where one might be very rich and one might be very poor, and we don't want the rich society to be seen as more unequal just because everybody in it is richer, right? Which is what will happen if you have mean sensitive measures of inequality. However, what the relative inequality measure really assumes, it's a conservative measure, which when incomes grow across the distribution at the same rate is unchanged, right? That's what's called distribution neutral growth path. So if everybody's income went up by 10% across the distribution, then relative inequality is unchanged. However, the absolute gap between the rich and the poor might have grown quite a bit, right? So if my income goes up from $1,000 to $2,000 and somebody else's income goes up from $10,000 to $20,000, the ratio of incomes hasn't changed, but the absolute gap between our incomes has gone up a lot. That absolute inequality is almost never part of inequality, even when inequality is in the curriculum. But when you talk to ordinary people, you talk to students who are thinking, who haven't yet been trained completely in the economics way of thinking, they will recognize that absolute inequality actually has relevance in people's lives. It matters to them. That everybody is 10% better off is a very impoverished way of thinking, saying that inequality hasn't changed. Now, all of these things that I've mentioned, these are all particular impoverishments that have been built into the discipline for political reasons, for justifying certain things that exist. And that, I think, pedagogically, to me, has really helped, is communicating this to students. Recognize the relationship between what the theoretical structure permits you to say and who benefits or who loses from our ability or inability to say those things or not say those things. And once you've learned to think in that way, you can appreciate the value of different entry points and different theories that allow you to pose questions. And to go back to the point I was making earlier, it's within economics that you will find a lot of these things. Even in somebody who is really, has been awarded the, the Nobel Prize and therefore is, a kosher mainstream economist, right? Amartya Sen. Even in Amartya Sen's work, you will find substantive ways of challenging what a conservative economics position would be on inequality. And we don't even have to go very far into a radical direction, because if you go more radical, you will find many more interesting things, and you should do that. But I'm saying that the tradition actually has a lot of room to talk about things. So the concrete pedagogical device that I think works quite well is role play and debate. So when you ask, and this could be between actually professors, which we have also tried sometimes and has worked quite well, is that you can ask professors to actually take on roles and argue out certain positions. And so I think students learn quite a bit from this kind of back and forth. But even better is for students to do this themselves. Assume a role for yourself. Try to stay within that theoretical paradigm. Try to find what arguments are sayable, what are not sayable, and then debate it out. I think you can learn a lot that way. The point about the plurality of traditions in economics, within economics, not only is it on itself a useful thing to remember, which is what Rethinking Economics, I think the whole initiative is a lot about that, but pedagogically it is a vital tool in economics thinking. And the more we bring into these different ways of thinking about it, a very simple example I'll toss out, again, what I've done in the past, just ask students to think about profit. Profit is a key category in economics. Think through how each tradition thinks about profits. Where do they come from? What is justified in the rate of profit? What is not? Right? And why? Why do certain traditions think about profit in the way that they do? And you can do that for many different concepts in economics. Finally, and I'll stop after this, there's a couple of exercises that we used to do when I was in Amherst, and we did these workshops for activists, which were the 2-week workshops in basics of neoliberalism. So what is neoliberalism, what is neoliberal economics, and so forth. We were doing these for people who didn't have any formal background in economics. And we would do some of these simple exercises, which were quite powerful. One is called the chair exercise. I've put it in the Google Doc there. All it was really is putting out 10 chairs in a room and assigning a person to a chair, which is an equal distribution of income, and then depicting any actually existing distribution of income, such as an American one, for example, by just having a person stretch out over the chairs. Right? So if, let's say, the top 10% earn 40% of income, then you have one person lay out over 4 chairs, and the rest of them have to squeeze into the other chairs. I mean, the thing is that you have to sit, right? You have to find a way to sit, and then as you increase or decrease that distribution of at the inequality, people are forced to sit in the smaller and smaller chair, less and less in space, and it's a very physical way of manifesting that inequality. And then, of course, that leads to discussions of why this exists and so forth. And even a more kind of powerful exercise that we've done is you line up people in a field, right? In an open field, and then you have a set of conditions, enabling or disabling life conditions. They could be identities. You belong to a particular race, you belong to a particular caste, gender, and so forth. They could be intergenerational things. Did your parents go to school? Did your parents go to college? Did your parents have their own house? Whatever, did your parents speak English? And for each of these questions, depending on whether your answer is yes or no, you take a step forward or take a step back from the equal starting point, right? So everybody starts off at the same line, and then you keep taking steps forward or back depending on whether your answer to each question is yes or no. And at the end of those 10 questions or so, you can see very visibly what actually is the state of play in that particular group of people, right? And most people are surprised to see the huge gulf that opens up between people who had to take 5 steps back and people who had, who could take 5 steps forward. Right? And that, of course, goes to the level playing field idea and all of that. And there are many such little exercises out there, which it would be very valuable to gather up, as a resource. So I'll stop there, and I can expand on anything in Q&A.
Thank you very much, Professor Asol. I think we will please, I encourage everybody. We saw with the last presentation that we took up a lot of time, so please can everyone post questions in the chat so that they can be seen, and so when we wrap up, it's much easier for us. So secondly, for our second speaker, we'd like to welcome, I'm so sorry, I'm just pulling up the biography. Professor Vimal Ranchhod, who's the Deputy Director of the Southern Africa Labour and Development Research Unit, SALDRU, based at the University of Cape Town. He teaches an honours economics course on the economics of inequality, and his research focuses on labour markets, education, poverty and inequality, and discrimination. He holds a PhD in economics from the University of Michigan. Professor Vimal.
Thank you, Bandile. Can I see my slides?
Great, we can see. Thank you.
Great. Okay, so I'm going to speak about this. Bandile has already introduced me. So I work in a place called SALDRU, which I think is a very cool place. It's a research unit based inside of the School of Economics at UCT. And I teach a class at the honors level on the economics of inequality. So these are kind of like the broadly defined goalposts that we were set to kind of think about teaching and learning tools, but within these broad umbrellas, approaches and methods, tools for teaching, how do we break traditional hierarchies in the classroom, and epistemic justice and equality of access. So I'm going to speak a little bit about these things, but really through the vehicle of the particular class that I have been teaching on. And I'll tell you a little bit about it in a moment. So it's a new class at the honors level. We taught it for the first time last year in 2019, and I teach it, myself and Professor Lebrand teach it together. That itself is quite different to most classes because when I say we teach it together, I mean we're both in the room at the same time. Whereas normally, even when you co-teach, you kind of share, this is your lecture, this is my lecture, this is your lecture, this is my lecture. So this is quite different, and I think it actually works quite well. So what is this class about? How does it actually work? So it's different to a lot of economics classes, in my opinion, because there's a lot of readings. It's much more of an arts type of class than a commerce type of class. We read books, we read at least 2 books over the semester, we read journal articles, and then we read a fair amount of popular media articles. So that can be anything from like The Conversation to the New York Times to the BBC. And there's lots of NGOs like Oxfam who sometimes put out stuff, which is not academic articles, but they're publications of a different sort. So my class, or our class, is very much an economics class. It's not really a pluralistic class. But even when you try to keep, I mean, I guess this kind of aligns with what Professor Bozzoli just said, that even if you stay within the relatively narrow confines of economics, there's still a lot of space to kind of cross-validate or latch onto other disciplines. And so at various points, we have these brief kind of overlaps with political science, history, sociology, health, And sorry, the second history should have been not history. I'm getting old. And we also talk a reasonable amount about moral philosophy. I guess the second one should have been moral philosophy, because it goes back to these questions of what is just and why exactly do we think that this particular welfare function is the correct one. And these are quite fundamental questions. So pedagogically, to be more direct about the pedagogy, it's also different. The class is very much a discussion-based class. Students volunteer. I put it in inverted commas because they do volunteer, but they also have to volunteer. At least someone has to volunteer, and if nobody does, then I volunteer them to lead the discussion on a particular chapter or article. And so the reading list is set and it's circulated beforehand, and then the lecturer, which is me, provides some insight and kind of guidance to the conversation, or I'll ask a question which I think will help steer it a bit better. But mostly it's a student-run exercise. And then I open and I close the discussions, but the kind of meat of the conversation is student-led and student-stimulated. So this generates a bit of chaos. Chaos in the sense that sometimes you really do end up talking about things which you had no idea would have come up. And sometimes it's great. It's super fun. It's insightful, and you learn things you never knew. That's part of the excitement of this class, that I also learned quite a lot in the process. A key thing is to maintain the space for respectful and constructive disagreement, because disagreement is really important, especially for trying to figure out how and why we think certain things, or why a different position may be also defensible compared to mine. But then you want to kind of really manage that process so that it doesn't become destructive or antagonistic. So it is very different to how most economics classes are run, at least in the South African context. So let's think about why we introduced this class. I think there is a growing recognition both globally and in South Africa about the importance of inequality for economic development, for how the economy functions, for social welfare, for stability. So inequality just as a theme has become more and more and more important in the last 10, 15, 20 years even. The second point is that this is the new class which specifically focuses on the economics of inequality. And the thing is that previously, it would not have been ignored, but it would have been a small module, like one module in a survey methods class or in a labor economics class, where you think about the distribution of income. But in that case, both the time and the kind of structure of the other classes limits both the breadth and the depth of what you can talk about for inequality. So this is something which I really do think was a good outcome of the protests from 2015 and 2016, because what came out of those protests were many things, including the need to kind of critically review our curricula. And the need for some change was probably a big factor in how it got recognized that we needed a class like this. So what works in a class like this? One of the things, and it happens in the first lecture, is we've got basically 12 classes, 12 lectures of 2 lecture periods each. So it's 24 lecture slots. And in the whole first one, all we do is introductions. And students are asked to answer a series of questions, and they're told about this beforehand. Why are you here? What's your background? What do you hope to get out? So what's your kind of reason for being here in an academic sense? And crucially, they have to say some story about what they can contribute to the class. And I think that last one is super important, because it changes the framing of the class. It's not a very, I'm going to come here and sit here and the professor is going to say stuff and I'm going to learn, and that's the point of it. It's very much a class that's calibrated on the principle that we all have something to contribute. We all have things to teach and to learn. And I think that's always going to be true. But in the South African context, which has this insane degree of, the distribution is so wide here that there's people whose backgrounds would come from different worlds. And so making everyone recognize that we all have something positive to contribute, I think is actually super important. We also don't have an exam. I mean, one of the things, at least at UCT, is that students are so focused on the exam and the grades, and we don't have an exam. But we have to do some type of assessment. So assessment is determined by a project which they have to decide on. So it's quite broad, the parameters, and it has to be something that they're interested in, right? So they set up this project and then they send us a proposal, and then they have to present their findings to the class, and after that they write a policy brief based on their findings. And I think this helps also because then you get a lot more freedom, but you also get a lot more buy-in. You can't say this is a boring topic because it's a topic that I chose. And then we often, in addition to the academic readings, what we do is we choose kind of random articles, often contemporary ones, but not always, which are easy to read and quite topical or broad interest. And these often end up being the stimulus points for a lot of conversation. So just a case in point, this morning I shared with my class a piece from the conversation on the inequality of funding for English soccer leagues because of the way the Premier League is functions. It functions that most of their revenue comes from television rights, whereas the other ones mostly comes from ticket sales. And in the pandemic, basically all except the Premier League teams are really, really struggling. And the author was making an argument for why the Premier League should be sharing their revenues in this moment. It's actually quite a fun article, I think. So I want to say it's all great, but there are challenges as always. The first is that there's free riding, that it's a type of class where you get out more if you put in more. That's true in all of college, but it's also true in life more generally, I think. But you also get out more if other people put in more. And so if you get free riding and you get too much free riding, the whole system can stop working, and it can work pretty badly, actually. And so that's something to always try to manage. But thus far, in 2 iterations, we haven't had a big problem with this, I haven't found. Some students really struggle with a lack of structure. So to some extent, I think because it's so different to certainly how the commerce faculty functions. You know, if you did accounting and taxation and corporate finance and commercial law, like it's so different. I think that some students struggle with this. And it takes some time to really find your feet in a process of this sort. We sometimes go off on tangents that aren't that useful, but then some of them are really great. And so, you know, you take the good with the bad. So on average, I'm happy with this one. I think the big issue is there's just too much stuff. We only have 12 weeks, and once you start allowing for the importance, and I think it is important, of other disciplines and their contributions and other disciplines' methodology. So economics has a whole lot of methodological debates, both empirically and theoretically, which then shapes how we claim to know things. But then all of that just gets exponentially more complex once you start thinking about other disciplines. And so to some extent, it still feels like we're scratching the surface and not doing a great job of building a coherent worldview on this particular topic. So for example, we only have 1 class on South African economic history and no explicit discussion of power. So, and that itself just means that there's limitations which you can't get around no matter, like, unless you have much, much, much more time. The other limit is implicit, that you can't have this type of class with too many students. So I was just talking to Kenneth Kramer in the breakout room from Wits, and he teaches first years, and first year classes are really big. They're typically 500 or 300, but then there's several, you know, groups. So oftentimes it will be about 1,500 total first year students. And that makes it very hard to run a discussion-based class. And I guess that just means that the pedagogical approach is sometimes constrained or shaped by the scale that is required practically. So just my final conclusions, I mean, not conclusions, but just thoughts, which it's been really fun for me to think about actually, is I really enjoyed this class, and certainly my co-professor, Professor Lebron, he also likes this class. Like, we get fun out of teaching this class. It will get better each year, at least initially, because you have a learning by doing process. There's a lot of soft skills which the students develop, or at least get the chance to develop. In particular, commerce students who can go through 4 years without having given a presentation or chaired a discussion or handled difficult questions, or like, I think there's a lot of skills which are life skills which are super important for our graduates to have, which they don't necessarily get in other classes. But there are some substantial limitations, and the big one, as I already said, is that inequality is multidimensional and interdisciplinary. And this class is not really that. I mean, we're respectful, but we're not an interdisciplinary class. So the one thing that I wanted to say is that has been recognized. Certainly at UCT, we have something called the Masters, the MPhil in TOJI. It's called Theories of Justice and Inequality, and that's an explicitly interdisciplinary interfaculty MPhil. So people from various undergrad backgrounds can do this MPhil, and it's a 1-year kind of postgraduate interdisciplinary course or degree. The last point, thinking much more dynamically, is that this class will almost surely be dependent on the particular lecturer. So we've set it up and we've got a course outline, we've got a reading list. But because there's so much chaos, it's also very hard to think about how to make it stable. And so if at some point I were to step down, or Professor Lebron wanted to step aside because he's very busy, the succession at some point will be a challenge for us to think through. And I think that's all that I have. Yep. Thank you.
Thank you. That's fantastic and very, very detailed, and I think hits right at the questions we're trying to answer. And I hope we'll engage on it effectively once you hit the Q&A. I'd like to welcome our next speaker, Dr. Hanna Szymborska. My apologies for pronouncing that incorrectly. Who is a senior lecturer at the Birmingham City Business School. Prior to this, she worked as a lecturer in economics at the Open University. She holds a PhD from the University of Leeds, specialising in inequality, financialisation, and economic policy through the lens of heterodox schools of thought. She's committed to promoting pluralism and inclusivity in economics as a co-founder of Diversifying and Decolonising Economics, a member of the advisory board of the Women's Budget Group, Early Career Network, team member of the Foundation Edward Lipinski, and a member of Reteaching Economics.
Thank you, Bandila, and thank you everyone for being here, and thank you to the previous presenters. I've learned so much from you. I'm really looking forward to the discussions. So I hope I'm not going to take too much time. I'm just want to, I prepared slides. I didn't know if I'm going to show them or not, but I think I will. So just a little bit about my background. So I am a trained economist from my early undergraduate days, but I have had the privilege of studying at a program that was quite heterodox and pluralist from the beginning. However, now I am teaching at an institution that is trying to satisfy the expectations of what is considered to be an economics curriculum, economics education, with the increased demands of producing education that's more relevant to the students, to the real world, especially given the criticism that economics as a profession has attracted during COVID, the Black Lives Matter movement, and earlier during the Great Recession in 2007 as well. And the majority of my students are from underrepresented backgrounds, which is probably unlike in some other universities in the UK. So it is something that is pedagogy of inequality is something that I thought of from a perspective of how can we take a curriculum that is in its core and its structure fairly standard, mainstream, unfit to really engage with these issues of inequality, and how can we take first steps to reforming that curriculum in the more kind of immediate term. Of course, I believe in the long term, we need to kind of fundamentally and radically change the way that economics is taught, and I'll talk about that briefly. But I've also prepared some points or reflections based on how we can manage the internal politics, the internal kind of power structures within our institutions as academics, and hopefully will also shed some light on for those of you who are students on how, you know, what actually some academics, lecturers need to deal with, and what kind of battles they need to go through to incorporate even small changes to what's considered the kind of the standard. Yeah, so is it working? The first lesson that is flows from my experience, my reflections, is that to study inequality effectively, we really need to look beyond what are the kind of broadly accepted boundaries of economic analysis. And I believe that in this discussions and in the earlier sessions today and yesterday, we have learned very clearly that the kind of what's considered the micro level processes and outcomes in economics are related to what's going on the kind of macro level or the global level. And we can't really fully understand either the more general economic inequalities without understanding the particular inequalities across different identities, social groups, and so on. And this is something that I believe, you know, it is not easy to implement, because it means that we basically tear out in a way this common approach to understanding economics and economics education, this need, and if this is the macro part of economics, then this is the micro part of economics, and we don't really engage too much in what is in between. So the first kind of question that I have to you for the discussion, if you want to engage with it, is, do you think that we should stop talking about macroeconomics or microeconomics when it comes to studying inequality? Should we just talk about economic processes in general, rather than trying to become so specialized, so narrowed down within the boxes of these different labels and what they carry with them? The second lesson that flows from that is when we talk about a curriculum that is very standardized and in the early stages of reform, what we need to do urgently as educators is to ensure that we include the study of inequality within the core curriculum across different topics. So ideally, what I believe we should be doing, we shouldn't be delegating studies of inequality to one module only. We should be, of course, having dedicated modules. It's absolutely essential, especially given the breadth of the topic, as the previous presenter has just explained so eloquently. But what we need to do is we need to go one step further and make sure that from the first years, the first weeks of their study of economics, students are exposed to the issues of inequality, and whether this is through the type of examples that are given, the type of context or the critical thinking that is attached to this kind of standardized curricula. I believe that it is crucial that we embed inequality within the core curriculum, because of course, when as soon as you start digging through the meanings of the standard models and kind of where they came from, the history of economics and the history of economic thought, it is deeply rooted in inequalities and injustices, both between individuals, between households, between countries. So we really need to revisit what topics, what methods, what scholars are included in these core curricula. Then the penultimate lesson that I wanted to reflect upon, which of course has been mentioned already, not just in this conference, in this event, but it has been mentioned for several years by students, by educators, that we really need to expand our study of economics to include a greater plurality of approaches. But as I'll mention in a second, kind of to wrap up my contribution, this pluralism is not just about making sure that we include different schools of thought. It is absolutely essential, as again we have heard from the first speaker, that we do have that plurality of different schools of thought, that we juxtapose them against each other, we contrast them, we put them in dialogue. Absolutely essential, especially because if we don't introduce these debates from the early days, then what we end up doing is we may even be communicating very harmful information about inequality, which is implied by this view of standard economics that focuses on inequality as a result of this kind of marginal contribution of each agent to production, or differences in human capital, which again, human capital is important, but it does not fully engage with the issues of structural causes of inequality. So how is inequality reproduced in the economic systems themselves? And in some extreme, it can even lead this kind of standard view of economic allocation that students learn in the very basic principles class, may even lead to rationalizing of discrimination and injustice, right? That some people are poor because they simply deserve to be poor, because they don't have that human capital, they don't contribute, their marginal product is not as high. So there is something else that's going on that's not down to the systemic causes, but down to this kind of individual behavioral differences, which of course is not only misleading, but also it creates barriers within the classrooms, because it goes against the lived experiences of many students and kind of sets them off to a completely wrong start in terms of their career, their ambitions, right? And something that is absolutely crucial is to be clear about the ideology within each approach. So I would argue that it's not enough to just include these different schools of thought. We really need to engage or be clear about certain ideological conclusions that follow, as has been described above in this slide. And of course, relating to that, something that, again, we have learned in the earlier sessions today and yesterday, is that not all aspects of inequality can be measured. So ideally, as the reform of the curriculum progresses further, we need to think of how to expose students to economic methods that are qualitative. And I think this is something that is absolutely not easy, not an easy task, but this is something that we need to challenge this view that economics is a technical, is kind of a positive science that's very neutral. This is absolutely not the case, and I think we need to expose students in the classroom to these different complexities, and having the faith, empowering our students to be able to handle these complexities, and believing that they can handle these difficult questions. They have the ability to do so, even if it requires practice. And then the last lesson or reflection that I have is that kind of summarizes some of the points I mentioned earlier, and it is in a way kind of perhaps a medium step, because it's something that can be in principle implemented more readily, more immediately, but as you start doing it, you realize actually that requires a lot of effort to make sure that your curriculum, but the core curriculum, including the issues of inequality, and the more specialized curriculum dealing with inequality specifically, needs to be inclusive in terms of the reading list, in terms of who is represented in the classroom, both from the point of view of the identities, the racial, the ethnic, gender, class identities, from the point of view of being inclusive of different theoretical and methodological approaches, something I have mentioned just a few minutes ago. And of course, something that is absolutely crucial, and it's crucial regardless of where we are studying economics, is to challenge the Eurocentrism of the profession and of how economics is taught, how economics is studied, because this kind of lack of epistemological diversity, i.e. having this very narrow view of what economics is, what economics does, what are the tools of economics, really feeds into this insufficient focus on inequality within the core curriculum. And by core, I mean the principles, your intermediate, advanced economic analysis, your research methods. And to finish off, what I'd like to highlight is that when we look at these different dimensions of inclusivity or diversity, what we realize is that they are related and deeply embedded within each other. So what we should aim for as educators who want to expose students to the issues of inequality, we need to take seriously this this challenge of decolonizing inequality in economics, of broadening the scope of who is an economist, what economists do, what tools economists use, and being able to precisely empower students, to give them the confidence that they are themselves able to address and they have the capacity to understand these complexities. Because what I feel sometimes, especially in the marketized module of higher education, where students are increasingly seen as clients, and this is certainly the case where I am at in the UK, there is this danger that we are underappreciating our students. We just want them to come up with a measurable, value added, like a measurable product of their education. And we do not nurture these critical abilities sufficiently because simply it's difficult, it's not easy, and it is uncomfortable sometimes. So while, of course, educators or lecturers have, I believe, the ultimate responsibility for the shape of the curriculum, we are, of course, working within structural constraints within our institutions, but also more broadly in the higher education sector. So it would be also interesting for me to hear what you think is the division of responsibilities, if you may think, between the perhaps the government, the universities, departments, and students, and what do you think, how students can effectively become involved in the shape of the curriculum? So I hope that this has been helpful, and I very much look forward to the discussions. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I think given the time and the crucial importance of having discussions, I think we'll forego going out into the breakout rooms. And I think we'll just head straight into some discussion on the questions, and I really hope people can stay with us afterwards again, just so we can exhaust some of the questions and we can hear from